All right. So today we're going to be talking about post-war Japan. Last time we talked about the Pacific War and how the war was ended. I made an argument that atomic bombs the uh, did not play such an important role as we thought. Instead, the invasion by Soviet Union's Red Army into Manchuria, is perhaps more important in smashing Japan's confidence in continuing the war. All right, so August 1945, the war was ended. Um, during the war, Americans learned that they know very little about Japan. They know very little about their enemy. And then later, Japan became uh, Americans' ally. So Japan studies started in the United States during World War II. Before World War II, we can hardly find anyone who can serve as a qualified interpreter uh, uh, in terms of Japanese language. So it's just, Americans just know so ignorant about Japan before World War II. But during World War II, some organizations were commissioned by U.S. government to uh, to launch studies on Japan, including languages, linguistic studies, including cultural studies, historical studies, right? For example, one such example is Professor Reischauer at Harvard University. He was the one of the first scholars commissioned by the U.S. State Department to launch a research on Japan, and he was one of the leading scholars after World War II on Japan. Today at Harvard, there's a Reischauer Center. Reischauer Center. It's a Japanese studies center. It's one of the best research institutes in the whole world. There are other researches commissioned by the government. For example, this one. If you look at this, oops, sorry. If you look at this book cover, it's called a Chrysanthemum and the Sword by Professor Ruth Benedict. Um, Professor Benedict, just like a Reischauer, uh, was commissioned by U.S. government to launch a culture study on Japan. Because during the war, a lot of Americans did not understand why and how Japanese behaved in such a way. For example, they would shout banzai, that means long live our emperor. They would shout banzai and launch a charge at enemy's tanks, or just still launch a charge when enemy is shooting machine gun bullets at them. So the Americans don't understand how could that kind of thing happen. So we need a scholarship. We need a new kinds of scholarship to make sense of such a kind of a behavior and a beliefs that are very different from ours. Okay, for example, this book uh, is such a product of that kind of a research. Professor Benedict was asked by government to delve into Japanese culture. Okay, so this is one of the books that sort of inaugurated a field that we call cultural anthropology. Okay, there are two kinds of anthropology. There are biological anthropologies. There is a cultural anthropology. Cultural anthropology looks at different cultures in the world to understand different human societies, right? So Professor Benedict looks at Japanese society, try to understand that culture. And the argument in the book is that, as the title says, the title is Chrysanthemum and the Sword. Chrysanthemum is the symbol of the Japanese royal family, and the sword, of course, is the symbol of the samurai. So, so Professor Benedict is saying these are the two symbols. Um, these two symbols are the key to understanding Japanese culture. What does that mean? Um, one of the major arguments made in the book is that Japanese culture is very different from Western Christian culture. Okay, um, Professor Benedict differentiates two kinds of culture. One is so-called the culture of guilt, That's the title. Uh, that's the title Professor Benedict gives to Christian culture. That means, if you know Christianity, of course, the belief is that we are born with the guilt. All humans. Okay, we're born with the guilt. So the central topic of Christian culture, according to Benedict, is how to deal with the sense of guilt. But there's another kind of culture. Which Benedict defines as culture of shame, and that's Japanese culture. That's Japanese culture. What does culture of shame mean? Okay, um, different from culture of guilt. Culture of guilt is sort of based on your belief with or your connection with God. Okay, it's a sort of a spiritual one-on-one connection. Okay, you believe that you're spiritually you don't have to care about what other people are talking about, but you have to deal with the kind of a spiritual relationship between you as an individual and God. So from God, you could have encouragement, you could have power, you could have all these spiritual power that helps you to turn against public opinion, let's say. But cultural shame in Japan is different. Uh, Cultural shame is based on your connection, not with your God, but instead your connection with the local community. That means your family, your neighbor, your social network, your brothers in arms, your colleagues, everyone in your society give you this pressure um, that creates a sense of shame. If you don't meet the expectation of your community, your family, your friends, then you feel this very strong sense of shame. You feel ashamed. Uh, so uh, in this case, we so so Japanese culture is different from Western Christian culture. See, somebody is saying he got kicked out from the class. Hold on a second. Let me stop the recording and solve this issue. Okay, we were talking about Ruth Benedict, the Chrysanthemum and the Sword, one of the first books that inaugurated the field that we call cultural anthropology. Okay, the argument of the book is that Japanese culture can be defined as the culture of shame, in which an individual has no individualized connection with God, but instead he constantly feel pressure from his family, local community, friends, colleagues. So when everybody in the society it collectively give pressure to everybody else in the society in terms of worship to the emperor, to sacrifice yourself for the community, to die for the empire, fighting in battlefield, then everybody is pressured to do so. So that's basically the argument. Okay, sense of shame, a culture of shame versus a culture of guilt. Um, Culture of guilt is something that Professor Benedict identifies in a Christian society where individual can have a personal connection with God, which allows him to turn against public opinion or peer pressure. So that's the argument. So in other words, the book identifies Japanese culture as a special, distinctive, um, a different culture from the rest of the world. But there's a problem in this. This book is very famous. Okay, it was written during towards the end of World War II. The research was done during World War II. But the problem is because of the war, Professor Benedict couldn't go to Japan to really study the society. What he can do is to what she can do is to go to Hawaii and interview the Japanese immigrants in Hawaii. So the sources or data that the book is based on is sort of limited, okay, because the author never went to Japan. But when the war is ended, the research is done. So the book was published right after the war. It was really influential. The methodology that looks at a different culture, sort of inspired inspired many other scholars in the field of cultural anthropology. But there are problems in the book. For example, the book did not talk about, say, class difference in Japan, right? The book just looks at the Japanese culture as a whole, as a homogeneous whole. It doesn't enter. When you look at Japan, the society as a homogeneous whole, you sort of ignore all these subtle differences within the society, right? For example, class differences. The book doesn't talk about that. Gender differences. The book doesn't talk about that. Regional differences, right? People from Okinawa, people from Osaka, they're different from people from Tokyo, right? The book doesn't talk about that. So the book is just the assumption of the book is to look at the Japanese culture as a whole, as a homogeneous whole, distinctive from other societies. So that's something interesting about cultural studies of Japan. This is one of the leading books. Okay, so back to politics.
I have a quick question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Um, for anthropologists today, what do you think they would like to look at? Like, what do you think would be the most important thing for an anthropologist to study in like modern Japan?
Okay.
Since we know so much about it.
Well, I'm a historian. Basically, the methodology historians use is to look at historical sources, primary sources that produced at the time, at the historical time, to analyze them and make an argument. For example, we may look at ancient records, right? World War II documents, right? All these things, but anthropologists work in a different way. Okay, they would do a lot of field trips to the culture they look at, right? For example, if you want to study Japan, then you have to go to Japan, and also the questions they ask are normally about a contemporary time because those are the questions that can be best answered by interviews, by surveys, by living in the culture that you want to study, right? So it's basically contemporary analysis, contemporary observation. I'm not an anthropologist, but I'm very intrigued by their works. For example, some of the contemporary Japan anthropologists, their research are, for example, let's say we know that adult video industry is a big industry in Japan, right? How is that industry work? How does it work? How is it related to the society? What kind of demand is from the society that produces one of the biggest adult video industries in the world, right? That's the kind of a question an anthropologist would ask, right? For example, other questions like, for example, video games. Okay, today we know that Japan is one of the biggest video games manufacturing or producing country, right? And billions of dollars are invested in Japanese video games industries, and there are so many consumers. So a typical anthropological question is, what does it mean to Japanese young men or teenagers to play 8 hours, 10 hours of video games at home? Okay, what is the social impact on them? How do they deal with the kind of the cultural content provided to them through video games, right? Those are typical anthropologists, just the questions that you could ask. And to answer those questions, you're gonna have to you have to go to Japan, right? And you have to interview people there. Yeah? You have to interview the teenagers. Observe their lives, right? To understand why would they make such kind of life choices as they do. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very, anthropology is a very interesting field. Although their methodology and the kind of questions they ask are a little bit different from history. Mm, from history, yeah. Because normally speaking, historians don't. Most of historians don't deal with the histories contemporary time. They don't deal with the histories that are less than say 20 years ago. Because when we're too close to history, there are a couple of things that are in our way. Uh, sort of hampering our understanding of history better. That is, first, sources may not be disclosed that quickly. For example, a lot of historians need government archives, but government archives are not declassified after like 30 years, sometimes 50 years. So you don't have access to the classified government documents, right? For example, if you were in 1950 and you want to, I'm sorry, if you were in 1945 and you want to understand how American government made a decision regarding Japan, you wouldn't have access to the classified archives. So that's one thing. Second thing is that for historians, when you're too close to the history that you want to study, your emotions or sentiments may overwhelm you to the degree that it sort of affects you, so it undermines your ability to analyze the history objectively, if that makes sense, right? But anthropologists, they use a different methodology to sort of offset this kind of question, this kind of problem. So that's the difference between historical studies and anthropology. Any other questions? Okay, so now let's look at the surrender of Japan and its impact on the Japanese society. Okay, a couple of major policy changes. Okay, so when ordinary Japanese citizens and soldiers learn about the surrender, there's a very strong sense of desperation, disappointment, and frustration. No less than 350 military officers committed suicide. They just, they're deeply overwhelmed by this sense of shame. If Professor Benedict is right, if Japanese culture really is a culture of shame, yes, then all these military officers they committed suicide out of shame, the shame of not being able to defend their country. Before the surrender, the Japanese propaganda system has been giving their population a message that Americans are demons. Okay, if we lose the war and if Americans come to our home islands, then they will act like demons. Okay, they will kill our men, rape our women. They basically would do whatever our imperial army would do in the regions we occupy. So there is a strong demonization of American military force. But the occupation of Japan did happen. Okay, it did happen. We know that the occupation of Germany was done by four allies, right? So at first, Russia, Soviet Union, America, Britain, and China, the four countries all are entitled to occupy a part of Japan. But according to agreements and other decisions made, because China, for example, China very quickly got into a civil war, and Britain is not interested in occupying Japan. So in the end, America occupied Japan single-handedly. Okay. General Douglas MacArthur was appointed as the highest commander of the occupation in Japan. So basically, he became the king of Japan for a couple of years. Okay. Most countries they waived the right to request war indemnity from Japan. The reason is multiple. Well, if you look at Japan, more than 60 cities were bombed, leveled to the ground by U.S. Air Force. There's nothing there. The Japanese people are starving. There's a lot of people starved to death after the war because during the last year of the war, there was a sea blockade of Japan. So no resources, no exports can reach Japan. The purpose is to starve Japan. But even after the war ended, still there is not enough food for ordinary people. So during the couple of years right after 1945, Japan is terrible. It's a terrible place to live. So there are a couple of movies about this situation. The couple of years right after the war ended. For example, there's a famous movie called. I used to show that movie to my in my regular Japan survey class. It's called Home of Fireflies. It's an animation movie. Later, it was the first animation movie that made a sensation. It's about two Japanese children, one boy, one sister, a big brother, and with a young sister. They lost their parents. The parents got killed in the air raids. And then the brother tried to help the younger sister to survive the hardship of the war, but eventually both of them starved to death. So it's a very, very poignant and sad story after the war. Okay, um, so most other countries waived the right to ask for war indemnity, including China. I mean, China could have asked for war indemnity, right? Because China suffered the most damages and casualties in the war against Japan. More than estimate is that more than 20 million people died in China in during the war, and a lot of cities are destroyed. All right. But both the Chinese nationalist government, both the Chinese national government and the communist government leaders, they waived the right to ask for war indemnity. So Japan did not have to pay anything. Well, there's nothing to pay at that time, right? It's all debris, ashes and debris in Japan itself, and everywhere people are starving. So that's the situation in Japan right after the war. Um, War crimes. Okay, there is a Far Eastern Advisory Commission established. Um, uh, okay, let's. Okay, the Tokyo Tribunal is not on this page yet, so we're going to talk about that later. So here, just remember, General MacArthur became the commander of the occupation of Japan, and he had a plan to reform um, wartime Imperial Japan, especially to dissemble the over centralized, over militarized, and even fascist like political system. Okay, so MacArthur flew to Japan and he met with Emperor Showa. Emperor Showa was very nervous, according to all kinds of records, before he met with MacArthur, because MacArthur pretty much can determine Emperor Showa's fate. If MacArthur is willing to, Emperor Showa could be removed from the throne immediately, and he could be imprisoned immediately, right? Because of the war crimes, the war crime charges. But MacArthur took advice from his colleagues and other people. The consensus of the American government at the time is that since America suffered so much casualties in the fighting towards the end of the war, they were afraid that if they removed the emperor, it will cause rebellion, revolts, and resistance from the Japanese people. Okay, and that will make it very, very hard for America to rule Japan. So a much easier way for MacArthur to do is to keep emperor there and tell the emperor what to do, so that the emperor would become a speaker of American government. That would make things a lot easier. So in the end, Emperor Showa is free of any war crime charges. He's basically freed. He's totally freed from any war crime charges. Okay, but this is very controversial. Okay, this is very controversial because some allies like China, like Australia, all right, Australia had many POWs, abused to death by in the Japanese concentration camps. So some Australians they wanna pursue the war crimes of Emperor Showa, right? They say, hey, look at Pearl Harbor. How come you don't have the emperor don't have doesn't have any responsibility, right? It just cannot be true. Some Koreans and Chinese they believe that if without the emperor's approval, the Japanese military system just cannot make such a decision to attack China, to attack America, to attack Southeast Asia. It just cannot be true, right? But history is what happened in history is that MacArthur decided that no, emperor is gonna be kept, and it's gonna be a constitutional monarchy in Japan. The emperor is free of any charges. Okay, so the emperor, of course, give order to all the local Japanese troops to surrender to the nearby Allied forces. No matter where you are. If you're in China, surrender to the nearest Chinese troops. If you're in Burma, just surrender to the nearby British troops. Right? Okay. So yeah, a lot of people are crying. There's a picture is taken when Japanese people are listening to the so-called jade voice of their emperor announcing surrender. Okay. Well, a famous story. There's some Japanese troops left in those South Pacific islands who have no chance to hear the surrender message. Okay, because many Japanese troops were cut off in those South Pacific Ocean, South Pacific islands, like the islands in the Philippines. For example, this guy. This guy is called Onada. Onada. He was left in one of the islands in the Philippines, and his company simply withdrew from the island without telling him. So he was left. He was left in the on the island. So the so most of his brothers in arms are returned to Japan, but he never received a message of a surrender or the retreat. So he left. He was left on the island, but because of the militarist education he received, he thought it was his duty to keep on fighting. So he never surrendered in that small island, and he used his rifle to kill any Filipino villagers he saw. Okay, and then the local Filipino villagers they were shouting to him saying, "Hey, Japan already surrendered. Come out from the jungle and go back to your country." But Onada thought it was a lie. He thought this is Japan's enemies' tricks to capture him. So he refused to surrender. So he kept on fighting, and he lived alone in the Filipino jungles for many years until 1974. Okay, until 1974, and during the whole time, he killed more than a dozen innocent Filipino local villagers because he thought the war is still going on. So the Filipino government is using a PA system to shouting at the jungle saying come out this Japanese soldier. So the war has already ended, many years ago. Okay, you should come out, surrender, and go back to your country. But Onada refused. He said, "I would only surrender if my commander come to me and give me the order to surrender personally." The Japanese just hierarchical like that. Yeah, they're extremely loyal to their superior. They would conform to their superior unconditionally. So even at that moment, he Onada wants his company commander to his captain to come to him and pass on the message. So Filipino government had no other ways out, so they had to find Onada's old captain during World War II. His old captain already returned to Japan, and he become I don't know, found another jobs, a businessman right now. But the captain was still called upon to the Philippines, and he gave the order to Onada in person in 1974. 1974. That's when the last Japanese soldier stopped fighting. Okay, only when Onada heard the order from his captain, he surrendered and gave his katana to the local Filipino government as a symbol of surrender. So, to a certain degree, World War II only ended in 1974? I don't know. No, that was a joke. This is just to say war is really complicated. So, and Onada in 1974 returned to his hometown in Japan, and there he lived all the way to 90s, to his 90s. So he enjoyed the longevity. So how do we evaluate this kind of a behavior? Okay, um, for a soldier like Onada, does his behavior represent honor, loyalty, and a sense of I don't know, a sense of patriotism, uh, or he is a demon that would kill innocent Filipino local villagers? Really, history is very, very complicated. It's always one historical fact could be subject to multiple interpretations. For some people, for some Japanese, Onada is a hero. Okay, he sort of he kept this his promise of a bushido, even in very very negative and harsh conditions. But for the local Filipino villagers, he's a devil. Okay. All right, MacArthur's reformer of Japan. First, MacArthur would like to um, repatriation. The first thing is to repatriate, disarm 7 million troops. Okay, 7 billion troops. There was more than 1 million troops in China, the hundreds of thousands of troops in Southeast Asia, and more millions of troops in Japan, and they all have to be um, disarmed and sent back home. And this was done. This was done very quickly. The Japanese are very, very loyal to their emperor. So as long as their emperor gave an order, say, "Hey, drop down your weapon, go back home," everybody follows. Everybody follows. There's basically no resistance. Um, so that's the first thing MacArthur did. Special hire police, that's the secret police in Japan, equivalent for the Gestapo in Nazi Germany. This secret police would censor any publication. They would arrest anybody who dare to criticize the emperor. Okay, so this higher police is disbanded. It's disbanded. The government is reformed, but not thoroughly as what happened in Germany. Okay, although 200,000 people got removed from government posts, but MacArthur still had to hire a lot of previous Japanese ministers or officials to staff the government because they could find no one else. Okay. There is an international military tribunal called the Tokyo Tribunal. Tokyo trials. Tokyo trials is the trials are the trials that charge those war criminals. War criminals. Okay. Um, for example, Prime Minister Tojo was sentenced to death. Okay, he was charged as the war criminal that launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. He's responsible. Other generals are also sentenced to either execution or death. About 20 high ranking generals sentenced to death. Another dozen so went to jail, including, say, General Yamashita, who led Japanese imperial troops invaded Malaya and attacked Singapore. We talked about this last time. So Yamashita, the British insisted that General Yamashita must be sentenced to death. And also the Japanese military general who is responsible for the Bataan Death March, in which thousands of American soldiers are mistreated to death. So those are the war criminals. At the same time, remember Soviet Union invaded Manchuria, so Manchuria, um, so Soviets also captured hundreds of Japanese commanders and military officers, and they were brought to Siberia, to a concentration camp. There has been a lot of studies about all these. So so some so those Japanese POWs and general and military officers who are brought to Siberia, they were trialed there. So there are two trials. One in Tokyo, it's called a Tokyo Tribunal. The other is Soviet trials of Japanese war criminals. Okay, So the two of them. Of course, this brought up a criticism, right? Because some critics argue that this is the Tokyo Tribunal is a victor's justice. Okay, what that means is that uh, Americans also committed war crimes in the war, right? Last time we talked about the bombing, the air raids of Japanese, more than 60 Japanese cities. Millions of people got killed in the bombing, right? General Curtis Lee May is the U.S. Air Force commander that gave the order to bomb Tokyo in February 1945. That one night alone, 100,000 civilians got killed. So, so how do you deal with that, right? How do you deal with that? As Curtis Lee May would say, if we Americans don't win the war, we will be tried as war criminals. So this really brought up the problem, the question of a victor's justice. I'm not giving you my own answer. So you want to think about this question yourself. Okay. Since MacArthur decided to keep the emperor is still considered as the living god for ordinary Japanese. It didn't change much in the years right after the war ended. Yasukuni, the national Shindo shrine, where all those where all those Japanese soldiers who died for the empire is are honored. This shrine is kept. Okay, Americans did not destroy this shrine. So Yasukuni in Tokyo is still there. You could visit that shrine. It's a big shrine, and all those war criminals who've been sentenced to death in the Tokyo Tribunal, their spirit tablets, their names are still honored in the shrine. Okay, there are still Shindo ritual performed to a ceremony performed to honor those who died in World War II every year. So every year when the I mean, we're talking about in later 20th century and 21st century, if the Japanese prime minister visits the Yasukuni in person, every time this happens, it will arouse some protests from Japan's East Asian neighbors, especially China and Korea, especially when nationalism is rising in China and Korea as well. So this visits, Japanese prime minister's visits to Yasukuni has been this a problem for the international relations in East Asia. It's a historical problem. It's a historical problem. Okay, so and also other smaller war criminals like those two captains who killed more than 100 Chinese citizens in one day. Actually, together, two of them together, they killed more than 200 of them. They were sentenced to death and brought to China and they got executed there. So these are smaller war criminals. MacArthur tried to decentralize the Japanese economy, okay, especially to dissemble the so-called Zaibatsu. Remember we talked about Zaibatsu before. Zaibatsu, Zaibatsus are the military industrial complex, the big companies that are producing civilian vehicles, but at the same time also military equipments like Mitsubishi, right, and many others. So MacArthur tried to disassemble those Zaibatsu. Um, and then land reform. The land reform is to redistribute land in Japan to give ordinary peasants land so that they could support themselves. So that's the idea. The project to disassemble or dissolve Zaibatsu did not succeed because the Korean War very quickly break out. When Korean War broke out, uh, Americans needed those Zaibatsu big companies to provide military supplies and equipments to American military forces in Korea. So Zaibatsu cannot be dissolved. So this is something incomplete. Uh, for MacArthur's reform. So those are big companies like Mitsubishi, Fuji, Nissan, Sumitomo. They're still there. They're still there. Democracy. Okay, Americans try to bring American-style democracy to Japan. Well, it basically, when Americans try to push American-style democracy in most parts of the world, most of the time it failed. But Japan is the perhaps the only exception that it succeeded. So Japan, to a certain degree, is exceptional in many ways. Democracy. Okay, protection of rights. Civil rights of ordinary people are to be protected. Freedoms of people are going to be guaranteed. Women's rights are written into the Constitution for the first time. Now women can vote after World War II. Basically all these political reforms were done under the bayonet of American troops. Minorities' rights, workers' union, all these are protected. Censorship is removed. So Japanese enjoy the freedom of speech now. Education reform also went on. The imperialistic or fascist ethics are removed from curriculum. Okay, previously in the 1920s and 30s, even ordinary children were taught to die for the emperor. Okay, and to consider that as an honor. But now all these imperialistic or fascist ethics, education content are removed from the curriculum. Political parties were encouraged to participate in politics. In 1940, Japanese imperial government abolished. They basically banned all political parties from joining the from participating in the parliament debate. There were only two. There were only two parties that are allowed to function in the parliament. So party politics were banned in 1940, right before the Pacific War began. But now it went back. It came back. The party politics have returned to parliament. The Liberal Democratic Party and the Progressive Party, they are active even up to today. Okay, well, in the first several years of occupation in Japan, the situation is very chaotic. For example, the comfort women system. The comfort women system is a system, we talked about this last time. Comfort women system is a system that the Japanese military authorities instituted to make sure that to sort of prevent the Japanese troops from raping the local women under occupation. Okay, so they recruited young women from Japan, from Korea, from China. Sometimes, a lot of times, they kidnapped women from those countries and have them serve as sex slaves in the Japanese Imperial Army. So when the Americans came to Japan, the Japanese are afraid that the American soldiers would rape Japanese women. So they continued. So Japanese government continued the comfort women system for a couple of months at least. So they built up all these comfort women stations to accommodate American soldiers. So if you look at this picture, these are the American soldiers waiting in the line to consume the sexual service provided by the so-called comfort women. But very quickly, under pressure and with a lot of criticisms, MacArthur abolished this system. But it did exist for a short time period. Constitution has to be revised. 1947, a new constitution was in place. So at first, the Americans they left the job to the Japanese to revise the constitution, but those Japanese legal specialists who are drafting the new constitution, they're afraid that if they keep too many content from the old constitution, Americans would not be happy. So they try to satisfy the American occupation authorities by uh, by making the Constitution more Americanized, by far more Americanized. Okay, um, a couple of major changes in the Constitution. That is, the emperor is no longer the symbol of the unity of Japanese people. Okay, according to the old Meiji Constitution, the emperor is a sovereignty of the nation. That means he's a symbol of the unity of Japanese entire Japanese nation. But now, the new constitution uh, took Western ideas. They gave the sovereignty to the people. Now the sovereignty of Japan uh, belongs to Japanese people as a whole. Okay, so that's a major change. That's a major change. Okay, and the Constitution also legalized the Allied occupation of Japan after World War II, and the parliament system is recovered. Is recovered. The parliament system was taken away in 1940. Uh, and then the emperor basically became a figurehead. Just like in medieval time. Remember, uh, before Meiji Restoration, Japanese emperor has been this figurehead, right? Because the real power lies in the hands of the shogun. Uh, After Meiji Restoration, the emperor it truly became emperor, but it only lasted from 1868 all the way to 1945. After 1945, his power is taken away again. Is again taken away. Uh, so, all right. So it's basic human rights, the women's right to vote, minorities vote, the freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedoms of publication. All these basic rights of people are restored by the Constitution, by the 1947 Constitution. The Constitution says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are the inalienable rights of the people. So basically, this is they copied a lot from American system. The 1947 Constitution is still in place today. Uh, okay, so when World War II was ended, the Cold War began almost immediately. Okay, um, so MacArthur's big project of reform Japan had to stop because of the Cold War. Okay, because during the Cold War, the major concern for Americans is to prevent Japan from becoming communist. Okay, you know, for the years following the war, Japan, a lot of working class people, they lost their job, they're suffering um, poverty, starvation. So there's a very strong sentiment, pro-revolutionary sentiment going on in Japan. But thanks to the American military presence in Japan, no communist revolution uh, broke out in Japan. It couldn't break out. So Japan did not become a communist like North Korea and China and Vietnam. It did not happen because of a U.S. Military occupation. Um, but on the other hand, demilitarization and democratization also happened, and these two reforms helped to stabilize the economy and the society. Okay, Japan became the major U.S. ally in the Asia Pacific region instead of China. So this is something really interesting. During World War II, China was America's major ally in Asia Pacific, right? And Japan was the enemy. So in 1945, America's plan is to support China and to suppress the Japanese militarism in the United Nations. Okay, United Nations is the international organization established after World War II to make sure the international security, right? So that's America's original plan. But in 1949, when the Chinese communists won the civil war in China, when Chiang Kai-shek had to flee to Taiwan, the status of China and Japan totally got reversed. Totally got reversed. After 1949, Japan has been the major U.S. ally in Pacific Asia, in Asia Pacific, up until today. Even today, it is still so. And China became the major competitor or opponent. Actually, during Cold War, China was the enemy. And this situation changed in the 1970s when U.S.-China relationship finally got normalized. Um, so in Japan, um, under American occupation, there was a red purge, that is to suppress all the communist and the socialist parties. 13,000 people got removed from government and businesses because they were um, the government suspected that these people got connected with the communism. In the early 1950s, there was a anti-communist um, sort of a a craziness going on in the parliament, right? McCarthyism is to purge any Americans who may or may not be connected to communism. So this is the early parts of the Cold War, right? Early part of the Cold War. So communism is truly it was represented as some kind of it was demonized. So for that reason, MacArthur abandoned the campaign against the Zaibatsu. Okay, um, and then in 1950, when Korean War broke out, Japanese economy very quickly recovered. Very quickly recovered. So Korean War is truly important to the post-war recovery or rebuild of Japan uh, after the war. As Prime Minister Yoshida says, Korean War is a gift from the gods. Okay, because $2 million worth of war orders or purchases came from United States, and that's equivalent for 60% of Japan's exports over the next 3 years. So with all these orders, Japanese factories are started functioning. They're started to hire workers. Economy is taking off. So that's Korean War. Okay, Korean War night from 1950 to 1953. Okay, long story short, we're gonna mention this very very quickly. Korea was under Japanese colonial rule for 50 years in 1945. Okay, Korea was annexed by Japan after the first Sino-Japanese War in 1895, and then after that, it was ruled by Japan for 50 years. But Koreans never lost their national identity. Okay, most of Koreans still want independence. So in 1945, they finally got independence, and then in 1945, according to the agreement between Soviet Union and America, the two powers they occupy uh, each occupy half of Korea, uh, with the 38th parallel as the separation line. Okay, so Soviets they occupied North Korea, Americans South Korea, and they each supported a government they favored. And then in 1950, the North Korean leader Kim Il Sung, he's a Soviet trained. During World War II, Kim Il Sung was fighting in Manchuria and Siberia. And now the he returned in 1945. He returned to North Korea with the Soviet Union help. In 1950, with some help from communist China, especially Chairman Mao, Kim Il Sung got several divisions of Korean. Uh, he received several Korean divisions from the Chinese People's Liberation Army. This became the bulk of his military force that he used to invade South Korea. So in other words, Kim Il Sung's army were war hardened in Chinese Civil War. Okay, many of them were war hardened in Chinese Civil War, but then they returned back to North Korea and invaded South Korea. Okay, so in June 1950, Kim Il Sung's army crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea in several weeks. They almost kicked South. They almost destroyed the South Korean government, and they almost kick out a small group of American Marines from Pusan. But in June I'm sorry, in September 1950, General MacArthur landed. Okay, so this is in September. The American and the South Korean army could only hold a small area in Pusan before they got kicked into the ocean. But in September 1950, MacArthur landed in Incheon, very close to Solu. Actually, if you go to Solu, you'll find out that there is the closest airport to Solu today is the Incheon International Airport. So if you go to that airport, you could see the sea, and you could imagine MacArthur's landing in Incheon. It's not a very ideal harbor, so the North Koreans did not expect Americans to land in this place because it's very difficult to land uh, in this place. But MacArthur managed to accomplish this. So this landing cut off the North Korean army into two halves, and then immediately the North Korean army collapsed, and they were retreating from the south. They were fleeing to the north, and Americans were chasing them. Okay, so so towards the end of 1950, American troops also crossed the 38th parallel. So first, the North Korean government broke the agreement between the powers, but then Americans also broke the agreement. So MacArthur crossed the 38th parallel, and they were chasing the North Koreans towards the China-Korean border. And well, the Chinese actually sent a message to MacArthur. They say, if you cross 38th parallel, we're going to militarily intervene. But MacArthur underestimated the Chinese fighting power. So they chased North Koreans all the way to the north. And then in October 1950, the new established communist China, called PRC, sent their volunteer, so-called volunteer army. They are actually the regular army, but they are called the Chinese volunteers. They crossed the Yalu River, which is the boundary between Korea and China, and they ambushed MacArthur's army in the mountains in North Korea. Yeah, last year there was a movie made by Chinese called the Chongqing Reservoir, the Battle of the Chongqing Reservoir. So if you know the military history, there's a major battle in the Chongqing near the Chongqing Lake. It's a reservoir in which the American army was ambushed by the Chinese, and then they got overrun. They had to retreat all the way south. Okay, um, so that's the situation. And then in 1951, the Chinese were chasing the Americans, and again the Chinese took Solu. Okay, and then the Americans launched a counterattack and take back Solu and pushed the Chinese back to the north of the 30th parallel. And then the war dragged on for another 3 years until 1953, when both sides got totally exhausted. They finally signed armistice. They signed the truce. Okay, so today the 30th parallel is still a so-called a non-militarized zone, but it's actually highly militarized. So there's numerous landmines set in this area. So it's totally it's a no man's zone. It's a no man land. Okay, so if you look at Korean people, it's pretty sad for the Korean people because look at the city of Seoul. It got changed hands 4 times. Okay, when Kim Il Sung attacked South Korea, it fell to the hands of the communists for the first time. And then when MacArthur landed in Incheon, Americans and South Koreans took that city again, second time. And then when the Chinese helped the North Koreans, they occupied Seoul for the third time. And then when the Americans pushed back, it changed hand. The city changed hands for the fourth time. Every time when it changed hand, there's a massacre. There's a purge. There's a lot of arrest. A lot of people died because both sides hated each other. So it's a terrible, terrible history for Koreans. For if you look at there are some pretty good South Korean movies about the war, because the war is a huge scar on the national memory, on the Korean national mentality. For many South Korean war directors, this war is a terrible war in which Korean brothers are killing brothers. So terrible, terrible civil war. But this war is heaven's gift to Japan. Okay, uh, after the war, Japanese economy really took off. Okay, if you look at the data, thanks to the Korean War boom, Japanese economy is growing at an amazing speed. Japan's GNP was $11 billion worth in 1950 and is growing by 250% to 1955. And then in 1970, Japan's GNP means gross national product. Okay, so a rough calculation of all the products produced in your country. In 1970, in the 1970s, Japan's GNP became $300 billion. So it is growing very fast. And in the 1970s, Japan became the third largest economy in the world, the third largest, and it's only the third to United States and the USSR. Okay, so after United States and the USSR, the third place is Japan. So that's how important Japan has become economically. 1951, San Francisco Peace Conference, um, in which 48 nations signed a peace treaty with Japan. This officially ended the war. Okay, World War II was officially ended by treaties. Um, and the occupation by America was ended in Japan in 1952, because in 1952 Japan has become a normalized country already. Okay, controversy over Yasukuni. Okay, we mentioned this before. The Japanese war criminals, their names are still honored in the Yasukuni, in the National Shindo Shrine. Every couple of years, the Prime Minister of Japan would visit this shrine, and uh, this will arouse protests by East Asian neighbors like China and Korea. Okay, the right wing remnants. Okay, in front of Yasukuni, every year there's still parade in which the veterans or those old or right wing militaries, they would perform a parade in front of Yasukuni to honor those who have died in the war. Okay, so this made some of Japan's neighbors, East Asian neighbors, nervous. Okay, nervous because they're afraid that the right wing militarism could return at some point. And also in the 1980s, Japan also changed their textbooks, their history textbook. Previously, Japan says we launched World War II. We brought a lot of atrocities and suffering to our East Asian neighbors. That was bad. Japan should never do that. Japan should become a peace loving country, peace loving nation. But in the 1980s, Japan changed their textbook. Okay, uh, they uh, they stopped calling the attack on China an invasion. They just said in 1937 we entered China, but previously they said we invaded China. So this change of wording made China and some other countries kind of nervous because they're afraid that the right wing fascism could come back again in Japan. Comfort women is also a major problem. That is sort of a problem for the international relations in East Asia. Okay, so we mentioned this system in during the war. Japan kidnapped many Korean girls, Chinese girls, to serve as sex slaves in the Japanese army, but they never apologized to these women until the 1990s. and Japanese government finally apologized 50 years after the war for comfort women only because of the pressure uh, that was that was on them from Korea and China. For example, if you look at these two bronze statues, one of them is a Chinese girl, the other is a Korean girl. The Koreans, they set up these bronze statues to commemorate the suffering of the comfort women, and they set up these bronze statues right in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul, Korea. Okay, so this happened in the early 1990s. The Koreans just put these two bronze statues in front of a Japanese embassy, saying to give a message: if you don't apologize, these comfort women will forever watch you. Okay, don't you feel guilty? So, okay, so finally, the Japanese government they apologized for the comfort women system. Previously the Japanese government, thought they claimed that these women are prostitutes, but they are not. Okay, we have historical records showing that many of them were kidnapped, or cheated, or they were tricked into the army to serve as sex slaves. So they had no idea what they're going to serve. Okay, 2002. Um, 2002, the Korean-Japanese relationship got improved. The two countries, they co-hosted the 2002 FIFA World Cup. So this marks a major step uh, of the relationship between East Asia. But Chinese-Japanese relationship still is has not get improved a lot. Okay, so economically, Japan is a huge success. Huge success. Okay, from the 1980s all the way to 2009, Japan remained the third largest economy in the world, and its GDP, that means gross domestic uh, product, has been going up until in the early 1990s. Okay, if you look at this growth, it's super amazing, super amazing. From 1990s to early 90, I'm sorry, to 1980s to early 1990s, Japanese economy is the best, the fastest growing economy in the whole world. But in the 1990s, Japan has suffered from a huge economic recession. In early 1990s, the real estate market in Japan collapsed. The stock market collapsed. All the bubbles bursted in the early 1990s, and then since then, GDP growth has been stagnant. Has been has been stagnant for 1 decade. Okay, a lot of the young men couldn't find a job. Economy is not really well. It's not really good. So first, the Japanese call it the lost decade. Okay, so in the 2000s, they call the past 1 decade the lost decade because the economy is not growing. And then the economy is not growing either for the next decade. So the Japanese call it the lost 2 decades. Okay, but finally, in late 2000s, economy is improving a little bit, but then it dropped. Okay. So it's kind of a so Japan certainly has said goodbye to the fast GDP growing eras, but instead, Chinese economy is taking off since the 1980s. Since the 1980s, okay. So this line shows the Chinese GDP growth, and it really took off. Chinese economy really took off in the 2000s. So in 2009, China replaced Japan to be the second largest economy in the world, only second to United States. So if you look at the Asia Pacific region, okay, if you look at the Pacific Ocean, okay, on right hand, if you look at the map, on right hand is the United States. That's the largest economy in the world, and on the left hand, on the west coast, west side of the Pacific Ocean, you have China. That's the second largest economic entity. And in between uh, China and the United States, you have Japan. And that's the third largest economy. So, really, the Asia Pacific region is super economically important in the world because the top three economic entities are all there. And if you add up the total economy of the United States, China, and Japan together, you basically get half of the GDP of the whole world. So these three countries are just important like that. Their economic size is 50%, close to 50% of the world economy. Very, very important. So some people argue that 21st century is the century of Asia Pacific. So you really have to look at this region to understand where the world is growing. Okay, although Japan in 21st century, the growth rate is not as remarkable as China's. So you know, old Europe is sort of not growing that fast. So you have to look at Asia Pacific to understand where the world is growing. This is the unemployment rate, a comparison of Japan, United Kingdom, and the United States. As you can see, when the world was struck by the last economic recession in 2008, we know that the world was struck by economic recession. Unemployment rate in United Kingdom and U.S. went super high, went sky high. But the unemployment rate in Japan, although it rose, but did not rose that dramatically as that in the United States. The reason is because a lot of Japanese companies are still has some kind of a feudalism in their company. That means they take care of their workers like the old feudal lords take care of their samurai, right? As long as you're loyal to the company will try its best not to fire you. But instead, you have to work super hard, okay? Super hard working, okay? We're not talking about American workers kind of a hard working. We're talking about Japanese kind workers kind of a hard working. That means work 12 hours each day, perhaps, okay? Uh, and the death rate for overworking in Japan has been the highest in the world since the 1970s. But the result is an economic miracle, economic Japan's economic miracle. Okay, um, the Shinkansen bullet train system. It was a project started in the 1970s, completed in the 1980s, connected Japan. Uh, this high-speed bullet train system connects different regions in Japan and make transportation very efficient. This is the Japanese bullet train. In the 1980s, it was the most advanced in the world. In the background, that's the Fuji Mountain in Japan. Okay, and then okay, post-war Japan. So today, Japan is this typical modernized Asian Asian country that is mixed with the old and new, the tradition and the modern. On one hand, it's the most modern uh, country in the whole world. On the other hand, it also kept a lot of traditions. It had kept a lot of traditions. Um, it's a curious mixture of all kinds of binaries. And Japanese culture experienced a major transformation after the war. Okay, it's very different. After the war, the kind of a fascist, uh, ultra nationalistic sentiment or ultra nationalism, all these things were gone. Okay, imperialism was gone. The new generation of Japanese young men, they from my personal understanding, I have some Japanese friends. They are peace loving. They don't like imperialism. They don't like ultra nationalism. They don't care about politics that much. Okay, very different from their grandfather's generation or the great grandfather's generation who have fought in World War II. The newer Japanese young Japanese, they're more concerned with the economy. They're more concerned with the personal entertainment, perhaps. Yeah, they would instead of unlike their great grandfather who would consider it an honor to die in Iwo Jima for their emperor. The new generation of Japanese spend a lot of time playing video games, reading manga. Manga is the Japanese comic books. They would watch a lot of adult videos. They would do a lot of personal entertaining. but they are not very interested in politics or imperialism or whatever, ultranationalism, fascism, all these stuff. Okay, so yeah, so after the war, there emerged a new type of Japanese culture, a new type of Japanese culture that is focused on the mundane pleasure of your life. Okay, they don't want to talk about all these patriotism, dying for the emperor, that kind of thing, or building a huge empire, competing with America. They don't talk about these things. They focus on the mundane, especially sensory pleasures. Okay, or they are obsessed with the cuteness, with all these cultural images. Okay, this is how the Japanese culture sort of conquered the world with their culture after the war. You know, before and during the war, Japan tried to conquer at least a part of the world by their military power. It failed. But after the war, Japan tried to conquer the world by, by culture, and it succeeded to a certain degree. The manga, everybody is reading Japanese manga, very very popular. Okay, and a lot of cultural symbols are created by Japan. The huge IPs like this one, Godzilla. Okay, Godzilla. I mean, I assume that everyone has watched the movie Godzilla. It's the movie series of Godzilla. There has been a lot of movies about Godzilla that has been made. So this is the latest, one of the latest movies about Godzilla. Last year there was a new Godzilla movie, right? Okay, if you think about the Godzilla movie series, this is clearly a protest, Japan's protest to nuclear power, because Japan is the only country that suffered nuclear attack, and hundreds of thousands of people died because of that. So Japan wants to culturally reflect upon this trauma. So Godzilla is one way for the Japanese to reflect upon the danger or the annihilation that could have brought that could be brought about by nuclear warfare. It's a warning. It's a warning that Japanese people sent to the world out of good intention. Okay, so this is the very very uh, demon-like Godzilla in recent time. But in the 1950s, when Godzilla, the image was first put forward, it was kind of cute. It was kind of cute. Yeah. Can you imagine this kind of a cute Godzilla coming out from the ocean? Not scary at all. But still, it was a warning to the to the crisis uh, of nuclear weapons. So this is 1954 original Godzilla. Pokemon. Okay, well, Pokemon is also another cultural contribution that Japanese made to the world, and this cult of cuteness. I call Pokemon the culture as a cultural symbol of the cult of cuteness. Yeah, so people are spending a lot of time being obsessed preoccupied by cuteness. They don't care about the large themes like saving the world, imperialism, that kind of thing. Okay, they don't want to represent a samurai culture or something. They want to just indulge yourself in those things that are cute. Okay, and there are so many of them. Okay, my son is a big fan of a Pokemon, but who isn't, right? Okay, popular culture. Popular culture is flourishing in Japan. To a certain degree, it can be traced back to the geisha culture, but of course, it's different now, right? It's a highly with a more capital investing in this idol industry. Right now, the Japanese idol industry is highly developed. Okay, highly mature, and they could manufacture. Okay, they could manufacture idols in a very professional way. Okay, for example, this J-pop, Japan pop band AKB48, right? This is a typical band, one of the most popular girls band. Every year they would recruit some new girls joining their band. If you get too old, you get kicked out, and then or you get some bad stories surrounding you. You get kicked out. So they want to make sure that there's always new blood coming into their band. Okay. So this picture, this photo shows in 2016, the a Japanese adult video actress received the Best Actress award at the DMM Adult Awards. So the Japanese adult video industry is comparable to Hollywood. To this ceremony is compared to Oscar. Um, Japanese adult video absolutely highly developed in Japan. In Japan, one of the largest industries. Okay, if it's, for example, this is a typically a anthropological study research question that you could delve into if you're an anthropologist, right? So, what's the cultural meaning of AV to Japanese? Why would this country is devoting so much resources into and time into this industry, right? If you look at the data, it's kind of amazing. The AV or adult video market in Japan is reportedly worth of 400 billion Japanese yen or 4 billion US dollars per year, and this data is unupdated. Right now, it's even much bigger. In 1992, over 11 AVs were made every day by over 70 production companies in Tokyo alone. Okay, can you imagine how many adult videos are made every day? The AV market was estimated to make up about 30% of Japan's video rentals. Okay, the one in the third of video rentals are AV. In 1994, around 14,000 AVs a year were being made in the country, in contrast to about 2,500 in the United States. Okay, I'm not proud about this number in the United States. As many as 10,000 girls attempted to get into the Japanese AV industry every year, every year. So if you look at this number, you may ask the question, what's wrong with the with them? So we need to understand. Well, perhaps we need a different time framework to understand the situation there. Okay, Japan's last decade. This is Japan's economic growth. It really went up from 1980s to to 1990 to 1990 to early 90s, and then it went down by 63%. So this is the last decade, and then another decade it did not went up. So it becomes the last 2 decades, last 2 decades. Um, so today's Japanese young men, they don't care. They really don't care about the large nationalism, patriotism, fascism, all these things. Um, when this little boy is interviewed on the TV, okay, I'm gonna translate what he's saying. He says, "For the kind of country that wants its own people to die for it, let it decline, let it rot." So today's young men are totally disagreeing with the kind of fascist or imperialist ideology their grandfathers or grandfathers believed in. Today's Japan is very, very different. It's liberalized, it's a highly mundane, it's full of a secular pursuits, even sensory pleasures. They obsessed with the little pleasures or cuteness that you could find in your life. Individualism is dominant in today's Japan. Collectivism that the World War II generation have been obsessed with is fading away. Is fading away. Collectivism is fading away. Uh, Now the society is facing a different kind of problem. Okay, today's sociologists or anthropologists probably could answer these questions better, but as a historian, I'm just mentioning these problems in general. Okay, one of the biggest problems for Japan is the aging population. Uh, as a society becomes more and more affluent, that means richer. When you become richer and richer, people tend to have less motivation to have children. Okay, well, in economics, there is an explanation. The explanation is that when people are poor, the cost and gain ratio of having children is favorable. That means When you're poor, the cost of having one children is relatively low, and the expected return is relatively high. But when you get richer and richer, and especially when the college tuition and the cost of college is getting higher and higher, the cost and gain ratio is getting less and less favorable. That means having one children, the cost is super high, but there is the expected return is getting lower. So this is why parents, people, tend not to have more children in a rich society. This is almost a universal phenomenon. Okay, this is not unique to Japan. Okay, for rich European countries, North European countries, if the government doesn't stimulate birth rates by giving parents, free checks, the birth rates would drop even more. Okay, Japan is one of such societies. Okay, I don't know why. East Asian societies are typically so. It's not just Japan. South Korea also suffered. Actually, South Korea is even worse than Japan if you look at the birth rates. Okay, and also China. Since China is getting richer and richer, so the birth rate in China is also dropping. It's getting close to Japan's birth rates. Very, very low. So if you look at this chart, this shows that less and less young men are willing to have children. They just don't want to have children. Actually, less and less young men even want to get married. Because getting married means, brings them less and less benefits. They would rather just sitting home, watching, I don't know, watching AV, watching Pokemon cartoon TV, or playing video games. That's what they want to do every day. Okay, they don't want to get married. They don't want to have children. It's too much work for them. Too much work for them. Uh, so yeah, we nobody knows how to solve these problems. Okay, Japan suffers the slow shrinkage of population gradually, and right now there are more and more old men. So as a result, the government is postponing the average age for retirement. So you have to work longer and longer before you retire. So in Japan, it's not uncommon for you to see a old man in his say 70s, even 80s, are still working in a grocery store every day. So it's kind of a situation that many people don't want to see. But on the other hand, the average life expectancy, thanks to the improvements of medical condition, and also the thanks to the diet in Japan, the average life expectancy in Japan is the longest in the world. So that's great achievements that Japanese have accomplished after the war. Um, so yeah, in Japan, you could see a lot of old men still working very hard every day, and since there are less and less young men, the Social Security in Japan is under huge pressure because when you have less and less young men, you don't have enough new blood coming to the society to pay for the Social Security for the aging population, for the senior citizens. So this is a big problem. This is a big problem. Um, if you look at the United States government, every time when we have an economic recession, no matter it's in 2008 or 2020 with the COVID recession, the government always print more money. Okay, we always print more money to stimulate the economy, right? We call this quantitative easing. This is just a fancy name for printing more money. But in Japan, situation is a little bit different. Okay, well, part of the reason is because Japan had a terrible historical experience of inflation. Okay, in the 1920s and during the war, Japanese government printed too much money. Okay, and it created a huge inflation. We're talking about inflation like more than 30% every year. Okay, see, in the United States, in December last year, we saw a record high inflation of 7%. But in Japan, the inflation could get as high as more than 20% and 30% every year. So this terrible inflation have traumatized a lot of Japanese politicians, so that they don't want to print, they don't tend to print too much money to solve the problem. But on the other hand, there's another reason for Japan's economic stagnation. That is, um, after the last market collapse in the 1990s, um, Japan, a lot of ordinary Japanese and also corporates, they're deeply in debt. It took them 10 years, 20 years to finally pay back the debt. And as a result, people are less incentivized to invest or consume. So funny thing is that when we see inflation in the United States, in Japan over the past 20 years, prices for groceries are actually slowly dropping because the economy is not expanding. The economy is not growing very fast. So the problem is people don't want, even when government gave people money, free money, they just free check given to them. They don't want to use them. They don't want to consume them. They don't want to invest. So this is the problem of Japan's economic stagnation. Uh, I mean, so far, since 2020, Japan, just like many other countries, got struck by the COVID. So we still don't see a major sign for economic recovery. Right now, the interest rate in Japan is negative. The government actually, the banks are charging you money for depositing your money into their bank. They don't want to take your money actually, but the problem is ordinary Japanese. They If you don't want to put your cash under your mattress, then you have to put the money in the bank. Although the interest rate is close to zero, or in certain occasions negative. So the economy is not very active. Okay, so this will pretty much end up our discussion of the Japanese civilization. Okay, so today in 21st century, we see a an amazing hybridity of modern and tradition in Japan. Yeah, quite amazing actually. You don't see this in any other countries. Although tradition is fading away, and the materialism, consumerism, individualism, all these are growing among the Japanese young man. So you see a totally different Japan today than that in World War II. So today's Japan seems to be ethnically pure. What does that mean? So if you look at Japan, it seems that everybody they follow the same ritual. They enjoy the kind of cultural unity. But actually, underneath this cultural unity, there are all kinds of discrepancies, all kinds of differences. It's just that the Japanese culture is pretty good at managing social differences. Okay, for example, in the United States, let's say the conservatives and the liberals, uh, we see a divided society in the United States more and more, especially over the past several years. But in Japan, you don't see that. Okay, you don't see that. Um, you see people are indifferent to politics. But on the other hand, if you look at their everyday life, there is a strong cultural unity in their everyday life. Okay, uh, political opinions will not divide Japanese people. That's because of the special structure of the Japanese culture. Very good at managing social differences using their tradition, using their culture, using their culture. So this is maybe something that Americans can learn from Japan. But on the other hand, uh, unlike the United States, Japanese economy is stagnant. The United States still have the most active economic developments, technological innovations, right? Pharmaceutical innovations. We have a strong power of technological innovations, right? Look at Tesla, right? Look at all these pharmaceutical advancements. United States is still marked by a lot of economical development, but Japan seems to be stagnant over the past decades. But on the other hand, Japan does enjoy a lot of social stability. Japan is the society that sees the lowest crime rates in the world. Okay, this is all again thanks to their culture, in my opinion. Okay, thanks to their culture, the crime rates of Japan has been the lowest. Compared to Chicago, Detroit, right? That Japan is like a paradise for people who don't like the crimes. Yeah, many Japanese just never lock their door when they leave their home. So where Japan is going? Where is Japan going? We don't know. But in foreseeable future, Japan is gonna continue to ally with the United States. It will continue to become one of the most important trade partner of the United States and a political ally of the United States, especially when China is rising, posing some kind of a challenge to the United States. This makes Japan even more important to United States. United States needs Japan to stand on our side to manage any change in the power balance in the Asia Pacific region. But on the other hand, Japan is also under the pressure of the rise of China. We don't have time to go into details, but the China-U.S. relation, I'm talking about China-Japan relationship, has not been improving over the past decade with the rise of Chinese nationalism. World War II has been this deep wound in national memory for many Chinese. There's a very strong xenophobia in China to blame Japan for all the sufferings and setbacks China has encountered in the 20th century. Um, so where Asia Pacific is going, we don't know. But Japan certainly is a very important country for us to look at, to understand the world, to understand our society, and perhaps to understand ourselves. So this is the lesson from for from this class, from this course. So we would like to use Japan as a mirror to look at it and to understand ourselves better. So this will end up our course. Thank you.